This story took place back in the distant 80s, when our city was swept up in the intoxicating wave of perestroika and glasnost. It was Andreuka who came up with the idea to put dark forces to work for small business. He also headed our enterprise right up until the very last day. But let's take it from the top. As I already mentioned, pluralism shattered the foundations of life as it was back then. Believe it or not, you could easily run into a real wizard or psychic right on the city streets. International Academy of Telekinesis proclaimed the sign on the wall of what used to be a warehouse for manufactured goods. Panacea Society of Folk Healers responded with a flashy ad from the glass repair shop across the street. Removal of curses and cancer treatment modestly announced handwritten ads in the windows of private homes. UFOs, poltergeists, the Yeti. Consultations invited a sign at the entrance to the boiler room and for some reason added, as well as brokerage services on the leading stock exchanges of the USA and Western Europe. In short, as Andreuka rightly noted, the city was just ripe for the emergence of a serious paranormal business. Black Magnolia, he announced one day. A cooperative. Sounds good to me, I agreed. But what about the competition? Healing, it's all covered already. Telekinesis, clairvoyance too. You can't make much money off the Yeti. And where would you even keep the guy, this Yeti? That's not it, Andreuka grinned. So what then? Castaneda. There are already courses for that. They even eat mushrooms there and then roll around on the floor. No, what we'll offer the client is a completely new service, communication with the afterlife, talking to deceased relatives, celebrities, and so on. At the same time, the dead will predict the future for us. I see, I get it, I caught on. Summoning spirits. No, summoning spirits is just spiritualism, that's old news. We're going to have the latest technology. I came up with it myself. I mean, we physically send a living person from here to there and bring them back. No way. I whistled in surprise. That's awesome. What, you can send anyone to the afterlife? No. Well, not just anyone, of course. Only our employees. You, for example, or me. I've thought it all through, don't worry. All I need from you is the apartment, the one at the end of the alley under the office. It's just sitting empty anyway. I'll put up the initial capital, and we split the profits 50-50. He talked me into it, and I shook his hand. The next day, the cooperative Black Magnolia was registered at the local executive committee. What fine young men, said the elderly secretary, stamping the official seal on our license. Young people are so educated these days. I'll come to you for a consultation. Just don't get too carried away with philosophy there. Why not? We both asked in unison. I recently registered a school of Eastern philosophy, the secretary lowered her voice. And when the tax inspectors came, they were all having group sex in there. See, boys, that's what philosophy does to people. And she widened her eyes dramatically. That same day, we went to the cemetery workshops and bought a coffin. It wasn't that pine box lined with calico that we're used to seeing in Soviet movies. No, purely for technical reasons, only a beautiful, expensive coffin made of polished wood with carvings and bronze carrying handles would do for us. This purchase cost us an unbelievably large amount of money. However, Andre parted with it laughing. Ahead of us awaited truly astronomical profits. By evening, we went to look at our future office. The house was mine, or rather, I inherited it from my grandmother, who had recently married a Canadian and moved to live with him permanently. It was a rather shabby and very old one-story building. Once upon a time, the house had 2 floors, but an aerial bomb that hit it during the war left little of the old building. Only the back wall survived, and to this day it still had window openings from the second floor. On the massive stone windowsills, already mature bushes of thuja and wild rose had taken root. The other walls and the roof were added later and were much lower. In this way, the whole building seemed to be glued to a kind of artificial old-fashioned backdrop. For an enterprise like ours, you couldn't find a better place. First of all, the gloomy gray beauty of the old masonry immediately put visitors in the right mood. And besides, the house was in a dead end at the very end of the street. Beyond that began a desolate, rocky hillside covered with wormwood and sparse, misshapen juniper bushes. The edge of the city and the end of the street were meant to evoke thoughts of the boundary of human existence, beyond which the unknown begins. On top of everything else, the building was almost a kilometer from the nearest bus stop, which also contributed to its remoteness from the hustle and bustle of civilization. And we took care of transporting the clients ourselves. It took about 3 weeks to prepare. We did renovations, bought and replaced furniture, sourced antiques and other unusual decor items. Special attention was paid to the props. Andrei took on the reconstruction of the coffin, which was quite a delicate task. We couldn't hire a professional carpenter, we had to keep the company's secret. As for me, I took on the work of a mason and plasterer. A rather unusual modification was needed for the interior wall between the living room and the bedroom. And since this wall was load-bearing for the roof, we had to work very carefully and even visit the library to study and calculate the engineering details. The final touch was a blackened sign with gold lettering, Black Magnolia, which I carefully cemented by the entrance. The advertisement Andreuka placed in the local newspaper promised clients unheard-of services, communication with deceased relatives and friends through a courier to the afterlife, fortune-telling, and information from remote corners of the globe and the universe. I have to admit, my friends' organizational skills were very quickly rewarded in a tangible, material way. Clients, as they say, started pouring in. A month later, influential Russian publications such as On the Edge of the Possible and The M Triangle wrote about the enterprise. A very flattering review appeared in the paranormal section of the domestic press giant Speed Info. It was a staggering success. This is how we worked. First, Andrei would take the order over the phone, since we only offered 1 session per day. Very soon, a substantial queue formed of people eager to communicate with the afterlife. When taking orders, we would ask what exactly the client wanted to find out and which deceased person they wished to contact. As a rule, people wanted to communicate with relatives. At that point, we would always ask for the name of the deceased and the burial place. There were far fewer people who wanted to talk to Napoleon or Peter the Great. All the orders were collected and organized in a special card index. The information the client wanted to know was also added there. Of course, this information was obtained from entirely earthly sources, the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, newspapers, bulletins, and news reports. And as for any missing details, our creative imagination and fantasy, mine and Andrei's, more than made up for them. In short, by the time of the meeting, most of the answers from the afterlife were already prepared. The session was held exactly at midnight. I would personally pick up the client in my car. I also made sure to create the right first impression. Dressed entirely in black, a suit, shirt, and tie, I set the mood for the client, putting them in the right mystical frame of mind with my appearance. Funeral melodies playing from the car stereo and the deserted landscape of the city outskirts completed the preparation, so by the time the ritual began, the visitor was already mentally prepared for anything. Crossing the threshold, the client entered a hallway separated from the room by heavy black curtains. Illuminated by the flickering light of a candelabrum, a portrait of Nostradamus stared at him from the wall. The first thing the visitor saw in the living room was a coffin standing on 2 chairs by the wall. Nearby on the floor sat 2 antique candlesticks, filling the room with an ominous crimson light. There was no electric lighting. Another candlestick stood on the table next to the great magician, a role assigned to my friend. Dressed in a red cloak with a hood that kept his face in shadow, he gestured for the visitor to sit on the other side of the table on a rough stool. Surname, first name, patronymic, Andreuka would begin in a harsh voice, placing a locked folder with the visitor's file in front of him. Purpose of your visit. The conversation resembled an inquisitor's interrogation, and combined with the mystical setting, it drove the victim into a state of sacred terror. Stammering, he could barely find the words to answer. Andre would make notes in the file. At a certain moment, he would seemingly accidentally drop his pencil on the floor, then stare intently at it. Suddenly, the pencil would start to move and, under the magician's gaze, begin rolling from side to side. Sometimes it would simply crawl across the table like a lizard. Then the magician would reach out his hand, and the pencil, without waiting to be touched, would leap up on its own to be caught. The thing is, inside the pencil there was a hidden steel rod, and a strong magnet was sewn to the inside of the magician's pants at the knee. By moving his knee under the table, my friend controlled the pencil. Another magnet was sewn into his sleeve, which is why the pencil would jump up as soon as his hand got close. After double-checking the visitor's information, the deceased's details, and the list of questions, Andre would hand the sheet with this information to the client for a signature and collect the agreed-upon sum. It was usually around this moment that the wall clock would start striking midnight. The visitor would typically jump in surprise and clutch at their heart. The mage would rise majestically from behind the table and approach the coffin standing by the wall. At this point, I would join in the act again. I would open the lid and help my friend lie down inside. All of this took place right before the eyes of the stunned client. I would kneel down, close the coffin, and, stretching my hands over it, recite incantations. "That's it," I would say to the client, rising from my knees a minute later. "He's already in there." With relief, I would wipe imaginary sweat from my forehead with a handkerchief and open the lid again for a moment. Now the visitor could see for themselves that there was no one inside. As I mentioned before, the coffin had a secret. Its side panel, the one against the wall, could also be opened like a lid. And in the wall opposite, there was a hole leading into the bedroom. That way, Andre would slip into the next room at the very moment I was reciting the incantations. Lighting a cigarette, I would offer the visitor one, pour some coffee, and turn over the hourglass. In 15 minutes, I would say curtly, and then fall silent, making no further attempt at conversation. The room would fall silent, the stillness broken only by the faint crackling of the candles. Meanwhile, the work continued in the next room where, besides a temporary hiding place, Andre had access to the library. Fortunately, some of the questions were known in advance. They weren't exactly original. "How's life over there?" Or, "Do you still remember me?" Since our company promised information from any point in the universe, sometimes we had to consult the encyclopedia. And we would always include in the reply from the other side some piece of information, usually something an ordinary person wouldn't know. That way, if the client later wanted to check whether they had been told the truth, they could make sure they hadn't been deceived. While in the next room, Andre would write down the answers on a special form with the company logo. As soon as the time marked by the hourglass ran out, I would open the coffin. The magician, eyes closed, was lying inside, I would bring him back to his senses by making magical passes over his face. Then I would help him get up and return to his previous seat at the table. At that moment, Andre would do his best to look utterly exhausted. And with that, the session would basically be over. The client would receive a sheet with answers from the world of the dead, and then I would drive them home. We worked every day, without any days off. As I already mentioned, there was no end to the number of people wanting our services. After a while, I noticed something strange. The work didn't bring me any moral comfort or confidence in the future. On the contrary, I started to feel melancholy and a strange sense of anxiety. On the one hand, everything was going really well. Money was practically falling from the sky. And yet, we were only busy for an hour or two a day. They wrote about us in the newspapers, people recognized us on the streets, and we were invited to conventions of parapsychologists and psychics. There was fame, there was money. Our friends from the Folk Healers Society openly envied us. You'd think, what more could you want for complete happiness? However, something just didn't sit right with me inside. Sometimes I couldn't sleep at night, replaying the last session or visitor in my mind. Once, we worked with a man who had recently lost his wife. Andre passed on a message from her that said, "I'm waiting for you eagerly." That man died 3 days later. And then there was that grandmother who came to visit her 5-year-old grandson who'd been hit by a car. All these people haunted my dreams. Did I have a conscience? I don't know. But more and more often at night, I'd get up, shuffle to the fridge, and pull out a bottle of vodka. Only after getting completely drunk could I sleep more or less decently. Aren't you afraid of God? I asked Andreuka. He would just frown and look away. Soon, another unexpected detail about our business came to light. Once a week, some short-haired, athletic-looking guys would visit Andre. He would give them a cut of the profits. And those guys also promised that if we shut down the cooperative, they'd send us straight to the afterlife. For real, no tricks. It all started out so well. Putting the dark forces to work for small business. What a brilliant idea. But it turned out just the opposite. Evil was running the show, and we were serving it. One day I noticed that, while walking around the city, I would automatically avoid the area where the church was. Was I really afraid of it, like the devil fears holy water? The portrait of Nostradamus in the hallway started to get on my nerves. It scared me so much that I tried not to turn my back to it. And as for the big room in the office, don't even get me started. It was overflowing with evil. Evil glimmered in the bronze of the antique candlesticks, hid in the corners, lurked behind the window curtains. It crept up cautiously from behind, waiting for the right moment to pounce, and instantly hid away. All I had to do was turn around. At night, evil would descend from the bare country hills and peer into the windows. And by morning, having turned into a flock of black crows, it would circle above the house. That man came to the appointment on his own. I didn't give him a ride. Of course, he made an appointment in advance by calling on the phone, but he didn't want to use my car and refused to give his name. A middle-aged man, dark-haired with some gray. He stepped through the door without hesitation as soon as I opened it. It was a little odd. Usually, visitors weren't so decisive. "I have an appointment today," he said in a quiet voice. "Good evening," I replied as usual. "He's expecting you. Please follow me." The mage, dressed in a red cloak, was as unflappable and mysterious as ever. Last name, first name, patronymic, he barked as soon as the visitor sat down on the stool. I prefer not to give my name, We already discussed this over the phone. The stranger's words sounded very calm, without the slightest hint of the usual nervousness. Purpose of your visit, the mage continued, opening a case file. To ask a question to a friend. Friend's name, Dmitry Krivitsky. When did he die? September 2nd, a month ago. Place of burial, First Cemetery, grave number 12008. The pencil slipped out of my friend's hand and, after dancing on the table as usual, returned back. What questions do you want to ask? Just one question, or rather, a request. The stranger suddenly hesitated. Or no, a wish. Yes, wish him something at your discretion. The pencil in the mage's hand trembled, but he held on to it. Are you sure you don't want anything else? The price doesn't change. I don't want anything else, thank you. Sign right here. That'll be 60 rubles, as agreed. Evil was creeping into the room. It coiled in rings, tense like a spring, ready to strike. The first chime of midnight made me flinch, as usually happened with guests. On unsteady legs, I approached the coffin and performed the usual ritual of sending Andrei to the other side. He's already there, I said, as always, lifting the lid, and looked at the guest. The lid slipped from my hands and slammed shut with a bang. The moment I met his gaze, I swear, he was smiling. And behind him stood Evil. It reared up and unfurled enormous black wings. I didn't see it, no. I just knew for certain that it was standing there. Are you all right, my friend? The stranger's voice snapped me out of it. Yes. What time is it now? 20 minutes past 12. Why are you fainting? There was a distinct smell of dead flesh in the air. Evil was somewhere nearby, preparing to strike again. I no longer had any time for the performance. Enough, it's finita la comedy. Get out, Andrei, I said loudly and, wincing from the disgusting smell that came from nowhere, I opened the lid. Instead of Andreuka, there was a horrifying corpse in the coffin, already showing signs of decay. I don't remember much after that. I know that I ran out of the house, sprinted through the night streets, and called for help. Evil, its jaws bloody, was catching up to me in huge leaps. And then I was fighting off someone's clutching hands. They knocked me to the ground, and I wanted to call the police. After I finally came to my senses, they kept me in the hospital for a long time, with bars on the windows. Once, a man came to see me, introducing himself as a prosecutor's office employee, and in the presence of a doctor, he carefully asked where the thing they found in the coffin in my house had come from. But the doctor, glancing at me, quickly led the visitor away. I fully recovered a month later, and when I left the hospital, I found out the following. In the office of the Black Magnolia cooperative, where I worked, they really did find a decayed corpse. Andrei, the chairman, simply disappeared. They searched for him, but without success. Meanwhile, the experts determined that the body found in the house belonged to Dmitry Krivitsky, who died on September 2nd and was buried in grave number 12008. Naturally, the prosecutor ordered the grave to be exhumed for investigation. That's when they discovered dead Andrei, tangled up in a ridiculous red robe. The specialist said that he had been buried alive. The case was closed after the investigator sought help from a well-known astrologer. He explained that such cases happen, and not infrequently. Just a typical anomalous phenomenon.